A black Navy SEAL stood in a courtroom branded as an aggressor with no weapon, no video, just one officer's testimony, and a system primed to assume the worst. When he walked through those doors, he wasn't merely a defendant, he was a challenge to their comfort and authority. The judge moved swiftly, ordering him cuffed without offering questions or a chance to defend himself. He remained calm because he carried a truth they hadn't yet uncovered, and before long, their facade began to crumble. He didn't stride in like a criminal or swagger like a hero. He simply entered in a plain gray suit, hands at his sides, fully aware of the verdict they'd already written. Sorry to interrupt the story. Before we continue, we'd really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us get closer to 1,000 subscribers. It means the world to us. Thank you so much. At the bench, the judge peered over the silver hair and pressed on with clipboard notes while the accusing officer lounged behind him, pride flaring in his polished uniform. The charge was straightforward assault on a police officer during detention. No camera clips, no visible injuries, just a white officer's word against a black man's reputation. The appointed lawyer whispered frantic reminders to stay silent, but he sat straight, recalling missions where a steady presence meant everything. As the prosecutor recited his report, claiming the SEAL had shoved him, the room barely blinked, eager to believe the familiar narrative. Then his voice cut through the tension. I never touched him. The hush that followed wasn't born of respect, but denial. The judge promised evidence would speak next, yet none materialized. Body cam files, corrupted security feeds lost, leaving only biased testimony. In that silence, the courtroom's true color was revealed, and it spoke volumes. They asked for a postponement. Your Honor, the defense attorney began until the body cam footage can be retrieved. Judge Kensington didn't hesitate. We'll proceed, he snapped, as though Darian's record, his sacrifice, meant nothing here. Adjusting his glasses, he fixed Darian with a steady gaze, not like one man to another, but like a technician inspecting a broken machine. You may have worn a uniform, he said, but in this court, you're just another defendant. Darian met his eyes without flinching. Then came the unspoken truth that filled the room. Some men enter these halls already convicted, not by the law or by facts, but by their skin. Officer Drake rose to testify, every syllable delivered with calculated precision. He was belligerent, ignored. 3 commands: shove me back. The jury nodded fervently, accepting it as gospel. No one paused to ask what those commands were or why a decorated Navy SEAL would erupt without weapon or motive. When Drake concluded, he added with a grim smile, I feared for my safety. In that courtroom, fear isn't weighed by evidence. It's measured by color. The young public defender rose again, voice wavering. Your Honor, proceeding without the body cam risks a miscarriage of justice. Kensington leaned back amused. This court won't wait for fairy tales, he declared, dismissing the plea with a knowing leer. As Drake passed Darian to return to his seat, their eyes locked for a heartbeat owner to conquered prey. Around them, the mostly white audience settled into its verdict before the trial was over. Darian remained motionless, fingers unclasping, only to flex against the chill of injustice, silently reminding himself that in rooms like this, stillness is more than consent, it's survival. The defense tried to challenge the officer's account, but there was nothing to counter in a courtroom already choreographed against him. Here he wasn't a veteran or a father, just a target dismantled in silence while the system watched. Judge Kensington doodled on his notepad, his verdict pre-written. Then Officer Drake rose coolly, warning, Your Honor, given the defendant's demeanor, he may be emotionally unstable. Please order restraints for everyone's safety. Darian hadn't stirred, but Drake's insinuation turned him into a ticking bomb. Kensington granted the request without a second thought, and the bailiff moved in. Darian stood slowly, extending his wrist for the cuffs as though he'd rehearsed the moment, the click echoing in the hush. A woman in the back, mid-40s, blue blouse, clutched to her chest, spoke up. This is wrong. Are you all just going to sit there? Her voice, trembling in anger, broke the spell. Kensington rapped for order, but the room had already shifted. With cold calm, Darian looked at the bench and said, You're not protecting anyone, you're reassuring yourselves. Silence gathered thicker than before. Even Drake blinked. The woman was let out, her words lingering like smoke. The jury averted their eyes, the prosecutor scrawled useless notes, and Darian sat straight, cuffed, unwavering. No outburst, no pleading, just a quiet truth they could no longer ignore. His court-appointed attorney finally spoke up. For the record, Mr. Cross served 14 years in the Navy SEALs, led classified missions, earned Valor Awards. Kensington barely glanced up. This is a courtroom, not a battlefield counselor, he said flatly, as if dusting off a sleeve. The room cracked. The tension shifted. At the back, an older man, weathered like stone, removed a frayed USS Carl Vinson cap, pressed it to his chest, and fixed his gaze on Darian as though to say, "We see you." For a moment his lips quivered. He said nothing, but the tears in his eyes spoke volumes. Then a memory surfaced years ago at a muddy forward base in Afghanistan. He'd been one of only 3 Black SEALs in his unit. They'd stormed a hill together, rescued a hostage, then amid the dust and chaos, a terrified young white private bleeding, and in shock looked at him and said, "I didn't expect you to save me." He'd only handed the soldier water and moved on. Back at base the next day, someone called him a war dog, and the room had laughed. That's when he understood that bravery had its limits. Some uniforms rendered you invisible, even as you bled for them. Now in this courtroom, he sat in silence, the heavy stillness of a man who defended a nation that refused to defend him. The judge continued scribbling, avoiding his gaze, while the handcuffs on his wrists caught the light like cold iron. An older veteran in the gallery leaned forward and whispered, "Out there, he's a hero. Here they call him a threat." No one contradicted him, no defense needed. The question was no longer guilt or innocence, but what this country chooses to see or ignore. Suddenly, a woman rose from the second bench, calm but resolute, holding a small black drive. Judge Kensington frowned and warned her to sit down unless she was counsel. "I'm Dr. Keziah Monroe," she replied evenly, "and I have footage deleted from the precinct server before any investigation began." There was a tense pause as she placed the external drive on the prosecutor's table. Kensington bristled at the irregularity. The prosecutor began to object, but Dr. Monroe held up a hand and explained she'd recovered the original file's time-stamped metadata intact from an off-site backup. Attorneys exchanged startled glances. Finally, the judge conceded, "Load it," and the drive clicked into the monitor. The screen flickered blue, and in that suspended moment, the entire courtroom held its breath. What came next would change everything. No timestamps, no voiceover, just grainy footage from a Mapleton precinct hallway. Darian sat in a metal chair pressed against the wall, wrists resting on his knees, face composed and unreadable. Silence reigned until Officer Drake strode in, not with casual patrol steps, but like a man hungry to prove a point. He loomed over Darian, jabbed a finger in his direction, paced back and forth, then slammed both palms onto the wall inches from Darian's head. The courtroom gasped. When audio resumed, Drake sneered, "You think that uniform makes you better than me? You people don't know your place." Still seated, Darian met the camera's lens and replied in a low, steady voice, "You don't own me out there in here, not even in this uniform." Drake's face twisted in rage as he grabbed Darian by the collar and shoved him back so hard the chair toppled. Darian hit the floor, but did not defend himself, not a muscle twitching. A stunned bystander whispered Jesus as the feed cut and resumed, showing Drake swaggering out while Darian calmly righted himself and stared unflinchingly into the lens. The hush that fell afterward was heavier than any shout. Everybody in that room had just been forced to confront the truth. Judge Kensington rose abruptly, tugging at his robe as if to reclaim attention, but everyone's eyes were fixed on the back of the room. A man in a gray suit, silent and still, until now stood moved with deliberate calm and walked out without a word. No one stopped him or inquired who he was. Yet his departure felt seismic, like pulling a single thread that unravels an entire garment. Kensington suddenly unsettled, rustled papers, glanced toward the door, and mopped his brow with an unseen handkerchief. In the hush, Darian's voice cut through softly. "Even silence carries weight, you only notice when it shifts." There was no challenge in his tone, only clear-eyed observation. A cough echoed, a chair scraped, and the courtroom seemed to tilt. The system that had marched on so confidently now faltered, not because of uproar, but because one man refused to play the role assigned to him. Power, it turned out, could wear quiet dignity. When the judge attempted to adjourn, his voice cracked, "This court will reconvene in 15 minutes. He swept from the bench without a backward glance. Darian remained seated, composed, yet profound eyes drifting to the blinking red courtroom camera. Soon the world would witness what had been concealed. 14 minutes later, the atmosphere was palpably thinner. Backs were straighter, breaths quieter, walls seemingly alert. The doors opened, and a young officer in a dark uniform entered, bearing a sealed envelope. He approached Darian's counsel, placed it on the table, and departed as quietly as he'd come. Darian's lawyer, usually invisible, straightened and addressed the court. "Your Honor, we have received an urgent communique from the Department of Defense." The room held its breath. Judge Kensington paused before beckoning the officer forward. With a precise flick, the envelope was open and its pages scanned. His face drained of color, the earlier confidence gone in an instant. His hand trembled as he reached for the bench. Phone dialed and listened. "Yes," he murmured. "I'm looking at it now. Can you confirm?" There was a moment of silence. Then the reply rang out. "He is active, protected, direct authorization." Kensington stood taller, as if straightened by the words, then spoke in a tone devoid of its former steel. "This court dismisses all charges against Mr. Darian Cross, effective immediately. This proceeding is concluded." The declaration hung in the hushed room, no applause, no gasps, just a sudden awareness of being part of something far larger. Darian remained motionless, unmoved, while the judge averted his eyes, adjusted his gown, and swept from the bench in silent retreat. The gallery stayed seated, stunned into stillness, until Darian's attorney quietly touched his shoulder and whispered words meant only for him. Darian nodded once and rose, not in triumph, but simply to leave the space that had tried to define him. As he walked from the courtroom, each footstep carried quiet authority. The officers and spectators watched, uncertain and awed. No one spoke, for his silence now held more power than any gavel. He stopped the center floor, turned calmly toward the room, not as a defendant seeking mercy, but as a man reclaiming his dignity. In the back, a white-haired veteran wearing a faded VFW pin stood first, then another, and soon the entire room rose. No one was told, they just knew. They witnessed true strength, a man who had been forced to kneel now standing free, reminding everyone that real power doesn't demand attention. It reshapes the room by refusing to yield. In that shared silence, Darian Cross's name became its own verdict. His robe seemed heavier now, too ornate for someone so publicly unmade. Then from the front row came a single sentence, not shouted, but spoken by an elderly black man who simply stood. "You earned it." The words didn't explode. They resonated. No one cheered, but breaths caught, shoulders straightened, and tears were wiped away as decades of pain simmered to the surface. Darian moved slowly down the aisle, each step reclaiming not only his innocence, but his humanity. Faces turned, seeing him no longer as a defendant, but as a man finally acknowledged. Near the exit, a 10-year-old boy whispered to his father, "I want to be like him," and the father just squeezed his son's shoulder, nodding. By the time Darian reached the door, the entire court remained standing in reverent silence, bearing witness to a verdict of spirit over skin. Standing center floor without cuffs or apologies, he looked once at the judge, who had refused to see him as a man, and quietly said, "I didn't come for your sympathy. I came because the truth deserves a place to stand." Judge Kensington's gavel wavered, but he offered no rebuke. Then one by one, a veteran, a middle-aged woman, others both black and white, rose without prompting. Not in applause, but in solidarity. In that hushed moment, procedure gave way to clarity. Dignity doesn't shout, it rises. Without fanfare, Darian turned and walked out, leaving behind a courtroom transformed by his stillness. Sometimes the loudest change comes not from noise, but from the courage to remain unbroken. 4 months later, the courthouse steps still bore the echoes of that day. The local police department, once so sure of its power, had quietly overhauled its training protocols and installed always-on body cams. Officers walked a little straighter, voices a little softer, as if they'd learned that dignity can't be handcuffed. Across town, community meetings brimmed with conversations about bias and accountability. Neighbors who'd watched from their porches now volunteered at youth centers, determined to teach respect rather than fear. The 10-year-old boy who once handed over that tiny flag started a stand-tall club at school, insisting every student learn Darian's story. At the VA hospital, where Darian had quietly volunteered his weekends, a plaque bearing his name now hung beside a row of service banners. He never sought recognition. He still arrives in plain clothes, but people stop him in the hallway to say, "Thank you for rising," and he simply nods. In the months that followed, the courtroom where Darian knelt opened its doors to public forums on justice, hosted by the same judge who'd once demanded that humiliating gesture. She began each session with the line, "Dignity doesn't shout. It rises," reminding everyone that the real verdict was written in silence, and change can grow from the quietest moments. 1 year later, the ripples from that quiet courtroom moment have become a steady current. The local police academy now requires all recruits to train under veterans who lived the silence of battle, and they begin each session with the simple mantra, "Dignity doesn't shout, it rises." Community organizations report a 40% drop in complaints about racial profiling as officers who once saw silence as submission now recognize it as strength. In Mapleton High School, the Stand Tall Club, founded by that 10-year-old, has grown into a district-wide mentorship program. Students lead discussions on bias in leadership, and graduates carry small flag symbols of moral courage into graduation ceremonies. The judge who presided over the case now chairs a statewide commission on law enforcement equity, traveling to courtroom after courtroom, urging colleagues to remember what they witnessed, that true justice sometimes waits in stillness. Darian himself has returned to service, this time teaching crisis resolution to new SEAL recruits and advising police-military liaisons on unconscious bias. He never sought recognition, but last spring, he quietly accepted a civilian medal for bridge building between communities and security forces. He still rides the bus, still wears plain clothes, and he still stands with that same composed calm. Because after everything, he knows that the power of dignity lies not in applause, but in the knowing silence that follows. From that journey, we learn that the power of silence does not stem from weakness, but from self-control and steadfastness. Faced with unjust justice, one can choose to speak loudly, but one can also choose strategic silence to compel the system to listen. Instead of shouting, silence fills the room with a void that truth can occupy. The message here is, don't let prejudice drown human dignity. Use your inner strength to resist. If you were in the protagonist's shoes, what would you do next? Perhaps you would share the story further, organize community dialogues to dismantle biases, or support other victims to find their voice. By 2050, will racism end? That depends on each of us. If we remain silent in the face of injustice, it will endure. But if we use quiet resolve to demand justice and then turn that silence into action, there is hope for a world free of discrimination. Silence isn't the only weapon. It can be the starting point for the light of conscience to shine through.